Hey everyone, my name is Rick Hammond, and this lecture today is on Tropical Ecology 101, Foundations for Landscape Architecture and Environmental Design. Now you might be wondering, why does a designer need to understand ecology? That's exactly the question I want you to hold in your mind throughout this lecture, because the short answer is, if you don't understand how tropical ecosystems work, your designs will fail. The tropics are not forgiving of ecological ignorance. So over the course of this lecture, we're going to build a foundational understanding of tropical ecosystems, how they function, what drives them, and what that means when you're putting pen to paper as a designer. Let's get started. Before we dive in, let me walk you through what we're going to be able to do by the end of today's lecture. First, you'll be able to identify the major characteristics of tropical ecosystems. Things like how they're structured, what defines them climatically, and how they differ from one another. Second, you'll be able to explain how climate, and specifically rainfall, drives ecological processes. Third, you'll be able to compare the major ecosystem types we're going to cover today: rainforests, seasonal forests, savannas, mangroves, and wetlands. And finally, and this is the one that ties everything together for the profession, you'll be able to apply ecological principles to real design decisions. Plant selection, site hydrology, restoration strategies, all of it connects back to ecology. Let me paint you a picture. You've been hired to design a resort landscape in coastal Southeast Asia. You've got a generous budget, a creative vision, and a client who wants lush green resort-style planting. So you put in a lawn, a row of ornamental palms, and a few exotic flowering plants imported from the nursery. 5 years later, the lawn is patchy and yellow, the palms have a fungal disease, and half the plants are dead because the drainage wasn't considered and they flooded during the monsoon. This scenario plays out constantly, and the root cause is almost always an ecological mismatch, a design that ignores the actual ecological conditions of the site. The tropics are characterized by incredible biodiversity, extremely rapid growth, and intense disturbance events: storms, floods, fire. Design failures here typically fall into a few categories: wrong plant selection, ignoring the hydrology of the site, mismanaging the soil, or creating a structurally simplified landscape that can't sustain itself. The core message I want you to take away from this slide is this: ecology is not a constraint on design, it's a foundation of it. Long-term performance in tropical landscapes depends on working with ecological systems, not against them. Alright, let's get grounded in the basics. What do we actually mean when we say the tropics? Geographically, we're talking about the band of the Earth between roughly 23.5 degrees north, the Tropic of Cancer, and 23.5 degrees south, the Tropic of Capricorn. This zone covers much of South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and Northern Australia. Now, what makes this zone ecologically distinct? First, there are no freezing temperatures. The 0 degrees Celsius threshold is the ecological line in the sand. Once you drop below it, the whole physiological toolkit of plants has to change. In the tropics, that constraint simply doesn't exist. Second, solar radiation is relatively constant throughout the year. Near the equator, the sun is always high in the sky. This means energy input to the ecosystem, the fuel for photosynthesis and all biological processes, is essentially constant year-round. And third, temperature seasonality is very low. In a temperate climate, seasons are defined by temperature: spring, summer, autumn, winter. In the tropics, seasons are defined by water. This distinction shapes everything from leaf flush timing to animal behavior to the way you design drainage systems. Building on that last point, if temperature isn't the driver of seasonality in the tropics, what is? The answer is rainfall, and the pattern of rainfall is the single most important climate variable for understanding tropical ecosystems. Here's the key rule of thumb. If annual rainfall exceeds around 1,500 millimeters and there's no meaningful dry season, you're looking at rainforest conditions. If you have 5 or more dry months per year, meaning months where evaporation exceeds rainfall, you start moving into seasonal or dry forest territory. But here's something that often surprises students. It's not just the total amount of rain that matters, it's the intensity and timing. A site that gets 2,000 millimeters of rain all arriving in 2 months of intense downpours is ecologically very different from a site that gets 2,000 millimeters spread evenly across the year. Think about what that means for erosion, for plant stress, for flooding. High-intensity rainfall events can strip topsoil, drown root systems, and overwhelm drainage infrastructure. So as designers, when you're assessing a tropical site, don't just look at the annual rainfall figure. Look at the monthly distribution. Look at how many dry months there are. That data tells you what kind of ecosystem you're working with, and therefore what kinds of plants and design strategies are appropriate. Now let's talk about something that fundamentally shapes tropical landscapes: disturbance. And I want to reframe how you think about this word, because in ecology, disturbance isn't inherently negative. It's a natural part of how ecosystems work, but it is something designers absolutely must account for. In the tropics, the major disturbance regimes include monsoons, those seasonal cycles of intense prolonged rainfall, cyclones and typhoons, catastrophic wind and storm surge events, especially in coastal and island systems, flood pulses, in Amazonian and Southeast Asian river systems. Rivers rise and fall seasonally by meters, inundating vast areas. Fire, particularly important in the drier seasonal tropics and savannas, where dry season fires are a regular and even ecologically necessary event. And finally, tree fall gaps, which might seem minor compared to cyclones, but are actually a critical micro-disturbance that drives forest regeneration. As a designer, you need to ask, what is the disturbance history of my site? What's likely to happen here over a 20 or 50-year time horizon? A coastal site in a cyclone-prone region demands a completely different design approach than an inland riverine site, subject to annual flood pulses. Ignoring disturbance is how you end up with beautifully designed landscape that gets erased by the first major storm. We've established that rainfall is the primary seasonal driver in the tropics. Now let's go deeper, because rainfall doesn't just determine whether a site is wet or dry. It fundamentally shapes the structure, physiology, and behavior of plants in ways that have direct design implications. Think about the difference between an ever-wet system, like a lowland rainforest in Borneo or the Amazon, versus a seasonal system like a monsoon forest in Thailand or a dry forest in Costa Rica. These aren't just different in terms of how much water is available, they're structurally different ecosystems. In ever-wet systems, plants don't need strategies to cope with dry periods, so they tend to be evergreen, with continuous leaf turnover rather than synchronized leaf drop. But in seasonal systems, dry season length shapes almost everything. Trees evolve deciduousness, dropping their leaves during drought to reduce water loss, just like a temperate tree does in winter. Root systems grow deeper to tap groundwater during dry periods. Plants invest in denser, more drought-resistant tissues. And herbivory patterns change too. Insects and mammals concentrate their feeding during the wet season when nutritious young leaves are available. If you're designing in a seasonal tropical climate, all these things matter. A plant that thrives in wet season conditions might struggle severely in the dry. You need to match your palette to the seasonal reality of the site. Let's talk about the ground beneath your feet, because in the tropics, it often surprises people. Despite the lush, overwhelming abundance of life in a tropical rainforest, the soil itself is frequently poor, and understanding why is crucial. Tropical soils, particularly the latisols, or oxisols and udisols, that dominate much of the humid tropics, are highly weathered. Millions of years of heat, moisture, and biological activity has stripped away many of the minerals that make temperate soils fertile. They're often acidic and low in available nutrients like phosphorus. So here's the paradox. How does a forest of extraordinary biomass grow on such poor soil? The answer is that nutrients are stored in the living biomass. in the trees, the roots, the leaf litter, not in the soil itself. The forest essentially recycles itself. When a leaf falls and decomposes, its nutrients are rapidly taken up by roots and fungi before they can leach away. The system is incredibly tight and efficient. This has enormous implications for design. When you clear tropical vegetation and expose that soil for construction, for roads, for planting beds, you can quickly lose what little fertility exists. And if you then plant species that evolved in nutrient-rich soils, they'll struggle. One bright spot, whitewater floodplains called Várzea in Amazonia receive annual sediment deposits from upstream, and these can be genuinely fertile, but most of the tropical landscape is not like that. On poor soils, the plants that succeed tend to have dense wood, tough leaves that are harder for insects to eat, and high allocation of energy to root systems. These are your design-relevant traits. Earlier we talked about disturbance regimes, the big events like storms and floods. Now I want to zoom in on how disturbance actually functions as a driver of ecological processes at the landscape scale. Think of it as an engine. It's what keeps the system moving. Let's start with tree fall gaps. When a large tree falls in a rainforest, whether from old age, wind, root failure, it creates a gap in the canopy. Suddenly light reaches the forest floor. This triggers what ecologists call the regeneration niche. Pioneer species, fast-growing, light-hungry plants rush in and colonize the gap. Over time, as the canopy closes, those pioneers give way to slower-growing, shade-tolerant species. This gap regeneration cycle is one of the primary mechanisms maintaining forest diversity. Now scale that up. Fire is a disturbance that operates at a much larger scale. And in the seasonal tropics and savannas, it's not a catastrophe, it's a regular event that many species are adapted to. Fire actually maintains savannas by preventing forests from establishing and taking over. Here's a concerning feedback loop worth noting. When tropical forest is fragmented, say by roads or agricultural clearing, the edge effects from wind and drying can penetrate 300 meters or more into the forest interior. This drying increases fire risk. More fire leads to more degradation. More degradation reduces the forest's ability to generate its own moist microclimate. It's a positive feedback loop, and not positive in the good sense. As designers working in or near fragmented landscapes, you need to be aware of these dynamics. Alright, let's do a quick orientation before we dive into the individual ecosystems. We're going to be covering 4 major categories of tropical ecosystems today. First, tropical rainforests, the iconic mega biodiverse evergreen systems we most often associate with the word tropical. Second, seasonal and dry forests. These are the systems shaped by that extended dry period we talked about, where deciduousness becomes a key survival strategy. Third, savannas and grasslands, the open, fire-maintained landscapes where trees and grasses coexist in a dynamic balance. And fourth, mangroves and wet tropical systems, the specialized coastal and freshwater wetland ecosystems that are among the most ecologically valuable and most threatened on the planet. Each of these has a distinct ecological characteristics, and each demands a different set of design responses. A plant palette that works in a rainforest context would be entirely wrong for a savanna and vice versa. So understanding these distinctions is not just academic, it's directly practical. Let's go through them one by one. Let's start with rainforests. When most people picture the tropics, this is what they see. Dense, green, layered canopies dripping with moisture. And ecologically, rainforests are genuinely extraordinary. The defining climatic characteristic is rainfall above 1,500 millimeters annually, with minimal or no dry season. In many rainforest systems, think the Amazon basin, the Congo, Borneo, annual rainfall can exceed 3,000 or even 4,000 millimeters. That's an almost constant supply of water. The result is extraordinary species richness. A single hectare of Amazonian rainforest might contain 200 or more tree species. By comparison, A whole temperate forest might have 30. This diversity is staggering, and it's a product of millions of years of evolution in a stable, resource-rich environment. But here's the flip side. Low species dominance. In a rainforest, no single species takes over. You might walk for an hour and not encounter the same tree species twice. This is called low dominance, and it has major implications for design. You can't model a tropical rainforest planting on a monoculture or even a small palette of species. The system expects diversity. This also means that rainforest restoration and revegetation require a much larger species pool than most designers are used to working with. Getting comfortable with species-rich planting is one of the key mental shifts for anyone working in a tropical rainforest context. One of the most visually striking and ecologically important features of tropical rainforests is their vertical structure. Unlike a temperate woodland where you might have 2 or 3 layers, a mature rainforest is organized into multiple distinct strata, each occupying a different position in the light gradient. Here's a number that might blow your mind. The light gradient from the top of the emergent layer to the forest floor can be 1,000-fold. That means the forest floor might receive as little as 0.5 to 3% of the sunlight that hits the canopy. Less than 3%. That's essentially permanent shade. The layers are the emergent layer. This is the layer with the tallest trees poking above the main canopy. The canopy itself, the continuous green ceiling often 25 to 40 meters high. The subcanopy, shade-adapted trees below the main canopy, and the understory, shrubs, small trees, and herbs adapted to deep shade. Each layer has evolved specific strategies for capturing light. Canopy trees orient their leaves horizontally and have large surface areas. Understory plants often have very large, dark green leaves to capture whatever light filters through. For designers, this has immediate practical implications. When you design a tropical planting, whether it's a garden, a park, a restoration project, you need to think in all 3 dimensions. You can't just plant everything at the same height. You need emergent specimens, a canopy layer, subcanopy planting, and a ground layer. Ignoring vertical structure produces a flat, ecologically dysfunctional landscape that succession will quickly reorganize on its own terms. We've established that rainforests are extraordinarily biodiverse, but ecologists spent decades puzzling over a seemingly simple question. Why? Why can so many species coexist without one competitive dominant wiping out the rest? In a resource-limited environment, you might expect 1 or 2 species to win and exclude the others. The answer turns out to be several overlapping mechanisms. The first is niche partitioning. Different species use resources in slightly different ways. Maybe one tree species peaks its root activity at a different soil depth, or flowers at a different time of year. These small differences add up to allow many species to share the same space without directly competing. The second is the growth-survival trade-off. Fast-growing pioneer species can exploit gaps in disturbed areas quickly, but they're not long-lived. Slow-growing, shade-tolerant species survive in the understory for decades, waiting for their opportunity. Neither strategy dominates. They coexist by occupying different ecological moments in time. The third mechanism, and this one is fascinating, is the Jansen-Connell effect. The idea is that seeds that germinate very close to their parent tree have a high mortality rate because species-specific pests and pathogens concentrate near adults. So seedlings that disperse away from parents are more likely to survive. This effectively spaces species out and prevents any one species from monopolizing an area. For designers, the takeaway from all of this is to embrace functional diversity, mixing trees, palms, lianas, epiphytes, ground covers, because that's what a functioning tropical system actually looks like. Let's bring all of that rainforest ecology directly into the design studio. What does it actually mean for how you make decisions on a project? First, shade tolerance is critical. Not all plants can grow everywhere in the vertical structure. When you're specifying understory plants, ground covers, shrubs, lower layer species, you need to verify that they can genuinely survive at 1 to 2% full sun. A lot of plants marketed as shade tolerant actually need more light than a mature rainforest understory provides. Get specific. Know your light levels. Second, gap-driven regeneration. In a rainforest, the most dynamic, fastest changing parts of the landscape are the gaps, where trees have fallen and new growth is competing. As a designer, you can strategically use this. Creating intentional openings can accelerate succession, but you also need to manage them, or aggressive pioneer species will colonize in ways you didn't plan. Third, monocultures are ecologically unstable. If you plant 1,000 trees of a single species, you're creating a target for pest outbreaks, disease, and structural collapse. Diversity is not just aesthetically desirable, it's ecologically necessary. And fourth, maintenance must anticipate succession. Tropical landscapes don't play static. They want to grow, change, and succeed toward more complex states. A maintenance plan that treats a tropical planting like a temperate garden, mowing, clipping, holding back natural succession, is fighting the system, designed with succession in mind from the beginning. Now let's shift to a very different kind of tropical ecosystem, the seasonal and dry forests. These are landscapes shaped by that extended dry period, and they're actually more widespread globally than true rainforests. They cover much of Southeast Asia's mainland, Central America, the Caribbean, India's Deccan Plateau, and large parts of Africa. The defining characteristic is 5 or more dry months per year. That's at least 5 months where rainfall cannot meet plant water demand. This creates a fundamentally different selection pressure on plant communities. The dominant strategy is deciduousness. Plants shed their leaves during the dry season to minimize water loss, the same strategy deciduous trees in temperate climates use to survive winter cold. But here it's about surviving drought rather than cold. Some dry forest species drop their leaves and simultaneously burst into flower, which is actually a spectacular visual phenomenon, and one worth considering as a design feature. Root systems in seasonal forests tend to be deeper, reaching down to tap residual groundwater or deep soil moisture during dry periods. And herbivory patterns differ too. Insects and browsing animals tend to concentrate their feeding on the onset of the wet season, when new leaf flushes are young and nutritious and defenses haven't yet built up. So when you're designing in a seasonal tropical climate, which honestly describes most of Southeast Asia, including right here in Thailand, you need plants that are physiologically adapted to drought, not just somewhat tolerant, but genuinely adapted. The ecological characteristics of seasonal and dry forest translates into 4 concrete design considerations that I want you to really internalize. First, seasonal leaf drop. Unlike a rainforest planting that maintains relatively constant canopy cover, a dry forest planting will go through a predictable cycle of leaf loss. That changes sun exposure, maintenance requirements, and the visual character of the space. Don't treat this as a problem, treat it as a design variable. Some of your most stunning moments might be when trees are bare and flowering simultaneously. Second, strong visual seasonality. While tropical designers sometimes try to create year-round green consistency, seasonal forests actually offer an incredible opportunity for dynamic seasonal character. Think of it like designing with the seasons as temperate designers do, but in this context, the transition is between wet season lush and dry season stripped back and sculptural. Third, fire-adapted traits. Many seasonal forest species have thickened bark, deep roots, or resprouting ability because fire is part of their ecological reality. These traits can actually be assets in a design context. Tougher, more resilient plants that recover from disturbance. And fourth, drought-tolerant species selection. This sounds obvious, but it requires discipline. It means resisting the temptation to specify plants that look spectacular in the nursery in the wet season, but will struggle or die when the rains stop. always ask, what does this plant do in month 7 of no rain? Savannas are one of the most fascinating and counterintuitive ecosystems we'll discuss today. At first glance, a savanna looks simple, scattered trees over a grass layer, but ecologically, it's a complex and dynamic system, and it's definitely not a degraded forest. The defining characteristic is the coexistence of trees and grasses. These two growth forms are competitors. They're both competing for the same resources, and yet they manage to coexist across vast areas. How? The answer is disturbance. Savannas are maintained by fire, grazing, and drought. In the absence of these disturbances, woody vegetation tends to close in and shade out the grasses, eventually converting savanna to forest. In the presence of these disturbances, particularly fire, trees are killed back or kept small, giving grasses a competitive edge. This makes savannas what ecologists call disturbance-dependent systems. They don't exist at a climatic equilibrium. They're actively maintained by recurring disturbance. For designers, this creates an interesting challenge. If you install a savanna-inspired landscape and then protect it from fire and grazing, it will begin to succeed towards forest. That's not necessarily wrong, but it means you need long-term management strategy. You're not just designing a planting, you're designing a management regime. Mangroves might be the most ecologically extreme tropical ecosystem we'll cover today. They occupy a zone that most plants simply cannot survive, the intertidal coast, where saltwater floods in twice daily, oxygen in the soil is near zero, and the substrate is often unstable mud. And yet mangroves are extraordinarily productive and biodiverse. The defining stresses are salinity and waterlogging. Mangrove species have evolved remarkable adaptations. Salt excluding or salt secreting leaf mechanisms, and specialized root architectures. You've probably seen the iconic prop roots of rhizophora mangroves or the pneumatophores, little breathing tubes of Avicennia. These roots expose above-ground surfaces to take in oxygen when the rest of the root system is submerged in anaerobic mud. Moving inland from coastal mangroves, we also have flooded forest systems. And here there's an important distinction in Amazonia between Várzea, which are whitewater floodplains with nutrient-rich sediment deposits, and Agapo, which are blackwater flooded forests on nutrient-poor acidic soils. These two systems, despite both being flooded, support completely different plant communities. The design relevance of mangroves is growing rapidly. As coastal cities face rising sea levels and increasing storm surges, mangrove restoration and planting is becoming a critical tool for nature-based coastal protection. They're not just ecological systems, but instead they're infrastructure. Let's look at what mangrove ecology means for design practice, because this is increasingly relevant, especially here in Southeast Asia where coastal development pressure is intense and climate vulnerability is high. The first implication is nature-based flood mitigation. Mangroves are extraordinarily effective at absorbing wave energy, reducing storm surge impacts, and stabilizing coastlines. A healthy mangrove belt can significantly reduce flood risk for coastal communities. Designing with mangroves rather than against them is one of the most powerful tools available to landscape architects working in coastal contexts. Second, coastal protection. This goes beyond flooding. Mangrove root systems trap sediment, build land, and prevent erosion. They provide nursery habitat for fisheries that local communities depend on. When you destroy mangroves to build a waterfront development, you're not just losing trees, you're losing ecosystem services worth enormous amounts of money. Third, limited species palette. Unlike a rainforest with hundreds of potential species, mangrove planting and restoration work with a relatively small pool of species suited to these extreme conditions. This actually simplifies selection, but it means you need to get those few species right. And fourth, high functional value. Mangroves provide disproportionate ecological services relative to their area. carbon storage, fisheries productivity, storm protection. In design terms, incorporating or conserving even a small mangrove area can deliver significant ecological returns. Think of them as extremely high-value ecological infrastructure. We've touched on tropical biodiversity throughout this lecture, but let's step back and address a bigger question. Why is the tropics so extraordinarily biodiverse in the first place? The tropics contain roughly half of all species on Earth, concentrated in a fraction of the land area. So what's the explanation? There are four major contributing factors. First, stable evolutionary climate. The tropics, particularly near the equator, have been relatively climatically stable over millions of years. They weren't glaciated during ice ages. This stability allowed species to accumulate over time without major extinction events resetting the clock. Time plus stability equals diversity. Second, niche specialization. In an environment with abundant resources and no freezing winters, species can evolve to exploit very specific niches. A bee that pollinates only one species of orchid, a bird that eats only one type of fruit. Over millions of years, this hyper-specialization has multiplied the number of ecological roles available. Third, coevolution. When species interact over long periods, pollinators and plants, predators and prey, parasites and hosts, they drive each other's evolution. This reciprocal evolutionary arms race generates new species and ecological relationships over time. And fourth, independent biogeographic regions. The Amazon, the Congo, Southeast Asia, other tropical regions have been isolated from each other by geography for millions of years. Each has evolved its own unique fauna and flora independently. So global tropical biodiversity is partly the sum of multiple independent evolutionary experiments. For designers, this diversity is a resource, but it's also a responsibility. The more specialized these ecological relationships are, the more vulnerable they are to disruption. Ecology isn't just about individual species, it's fundamentally about relationships. And in the tropics, some of these relationships are so tightly co-evolved that disrupting one side of the interaction cascades through the entire system. Let's walk through the four interactions most relevant to you as designers. Pollination. Many tropical plants depend on highly specific pollinators, particularly bee species, certain hummingbirds, bats. If you're doing a restoration project and you introduce plants without their pollinators present, you may get establishment without long-term reproduction. Think about your fauna when you're specifying your flora. Seed dispersal. Most large tropical trees depend on animals to move their seeds. Monkeys, hornbills, elephants, large frugivores carry seeds away from their parent trees, which, remember the Jansen-Connell effect, is crucial for successful germination. In fragmented landscapes where large animals are absent, seed dispersal breaks down. Trees can't regenerate naturally. This is called defaunation, and it's a serious and often invisible form of ecosystem degradation. Mutualisms, like the famous fig-wasp relationship, where every fig species has its own wasp species for pollination, remove the wasp and the fig can't reproduce. Remove the fig and the wasp goes extinct. These tightly linked pairs are ecological keystones. And defaunation more broadly impacts regeneration in ways that aren't immediately visible. A forest can look intact structurally but be functionally dead, unable to regenerate, because the animals that maintain it are gone. As designers, you can support these relationships by selecting plants that provide food and habitat for relevant fauna. This slide brings the biodiversity section to a practical close, and I want to make sure these four principles really land. First, avoid monocultures. I've said this before, but it bears repeating. In a tropical context, monocultures are not just ecologically problematic, they're practically risky. A single pathogen or insect outbreak can devastate a monoculture planting. Diversify your palette, even if it makes procurement more complex. Second, space conspecifics. That's a fancy way of saying don't plant too many of the same species close together. Remember the Jansen-Connell effect. High density of the same species creates conditions for pests and pathogens to build up. Spreading individuals of the same species across a site mimics natural spacing patterns and reduces this risk. Third, support fauna as design partners. Think about what birds, bats, and insects your planting might attract or acquire. Bat-pollinated plants in an urban park can actually function better than insect-pollinated ones in some contexts. Incorporating fruiting trees that attract seed-dispersing birds can help your landscape self-recruit species over time. Let animals do some of the restoration work for you. And fourth, for species that can't disperse themselves into your site, shade-tolerant late successional species, for example, you may need to introduce them manually. Don't assume the landscape will assemble itself completely without your help. Before we talk about modern threats to tropical ecosystems, I want to spend a moment acknowledging something that often gets overlooked in design and ecology courses: the role of indigenous and traditional communities in shaping and stewarding tropical landscapes over thousands of years. The first system is shifting cultivation. A community clears a small patch of forest, farms it for a few years until soil fertility declines, then moves on and lets the forest regrow. Over a 20 to 30-year cycle, the forest recovers and the nutrient cycle resets. Done at low population densities and appropriate scales, this is actually a sustainable system that has maintained forest cover across vast areas of the tropics for millennia. The forest patches in different stages of recovery actually increase landscape level biodiversity. The second system is agroforestry, integrating crops like cacao, coffee, and fruit trees within a multi-layered forest structure. A traditional cacao garden in Indonesia or West Africa can support remarkable biodiversity compared to a monoculture plantation, while still producing commercially valuable crops. And third, indigenous managed lands in the tropics often have better forest cover and biodiversity outcomes than even formally protected government reserves. Indigenous communities have ecological knowledge accumulated over generations that Western science is only beginning to understand. The design lesson here: local ecological knowledge is a resource. Engage with communities, learn from them. Don't assume that Western ecological science has all the answers. Unfortunately, traditional land stewardship is being overwhelmed by modern pressures at an unprecedented scale. And as landscape architects, you'll often be working in contexts shaped by these pressures, or actively trying to mitigate them. The first is logging. Commercial logging, both legal and illegal, removes large trees, fragments canopy cover, opens the forest to drying and wind, and creates road networks that become vectors for further encroachment. Even selective logging has significant ecological consequences because the remaining forest is disturbed, fragmented, or degraded. The second is fragmentation. When forest is divided into patches by roads, agriculture, or development, it creates edge effects that penetrate up to 300 meters into the interior. Edge areas are warmer, drier, and windier than forest interior, and these conditions favor aggressive pioneer species, lianas, and fire over mature forest communities. The third is fire feedback loops. As fragmentation increases, edge area and drying, forests that were naturally fire resistant become vulnerable. Once fire establishes, it creates conditions for more fire. Degraded, grass-invaded forest burns more easily, releasing carbon, drying the landscape further, and making restoration progressively harder. And the fourth is urban expansion. Cities across the tropics are growing at extraordinary rates. Bangkok, Jakarta, Manila, Sao Paulo are all expanding into surrounding ecosystems. This expansion is often unplanned, and its ecological footprint extends far beyond the physical boundary of the urban area. Understanding these pressures helps you as a designer advocate for and design toward more ecologically responsible outcomes. Here's something important that often gets missed in conservation discussions. Most of the tropical landscape is not pristine primary forest. It's secondary forest. Forest that has been disturbed, cleared, and is in some stage of regrowing. And that means understanding secondary succession is not just ecologically interesting, but it's practically essential for anyone doing restoration or adaptive landscape work in the tropics. Secondary succession moves through recognizable phases. Stand initiation is the early phase. Fast-growing pioneer species colonize disturbed ground quickly. Stem exclusion follows, where intense competition between young plants leads to high mortality and a thinning of the stand. Then comes understory reinitiation. As the canopy closes and stabilizes, shade-tolerant understory species begin to establish underneath. Here's a critical insight from succession research. Structure recovers faster than composition. That means the height, canopy cover, and basic forest architecture of a secondary forest can return to something resembling old growth within decades. But the species composition, particularly the rare, specialist, late successional species, can take centuries to recover, if they recover at all. Some species are simply not present in the seed bank or can't disperse to the site. This leads to the concept of novel ecosystems. Landscapes where the disturbance has been so significant, or the introduction of exotic species so extensive, that the system will never return to its pre-disturbance state. Working with novel ecosystems rather than always trying to restore to a historical baseline is increasingly being recognized as a pragmatic and ecologically valid approach. If secondary succession is the dominant ecological process shaping tropical landscapes, then designing with succession, rather than against it, is one of the more powerful strategies available to you as designers. Here's what that looks like in practice. Plant mixed guilds. Don't just plant all your species at the same successional stage. Mix early successional pioneer species with mid-successional and late successional species together in the same planting. The pioneers establish quickly, create shade and microclimate conditions, and then begin to be replaced by the slower-growing later species over time. Combining pioneers plus late successional species is core of what's sometimes called the framework species method, developed originally in Thailand, where a small suite of fast-growing canopy-forming species is planted to create forest structure quickly, while more diverse understory and canopy species are added subsequently. Plan for canopy turnover. Pioneer trees are not permanent. Many of the fast-growing species you plant in year 1 will be dead or suppressed by year 15 or 20. Design your planting to expect this. The late successional species you plant today may seem small and unremarkable for years, but they're the foundation of the long-term landscape. And finally, expect mortality. Especially in the early phases of a tropical restoration or revegetation project, mortality is normal. It's part of succession. Don't treat it as failure. Treat it as a signal about site conditions and adjust accordingly. One of the most elegant and practically effective approaches to tropical restoration is something called the nucleation model. And I want to describe it because it's a great example of ecological thinking directly informing design strategy. The traditional approach to revegetation is grid planting. You plant species evenly across a site in regular rows or a grid pattern. It's organized, it's easy to manage, it looks planned, but ecologically it's actually not very efficient or resilient. The nucleation model takes a different approach. Instead of planting everywhere at once, you plant in clusters, little islands or nuclei of trees scattered across the site. These clusters grow and develop more quickly than isolated individual plantings, creating patches of shade and microclimate that facilitate the establishment of more species. And critically, these patches attract birds and bats, which bring seeds from the surrounding landscape into the restoration area. Over time, the nuclei expand and coalesce. They grow towards each other and eventually merge into continuous cover. The landscape self-organizes toward forest. guided by the initial planting design and assisted by the fauna you've attracted. Research in the Brazilian Atlantic forest and in Southeast Asia has shown that nucleation produces more diverse and resilient forest cover than conventional grid planting, often at a lower cost. It also looks more naturalistic, organic patches rather than rows, which can be an aesthetic advantage in park and conservation design contexts. The lesson: work with natural processes rather than imposing uniform structure, designed for ecological outcomes, not just visual order. Even with the best ecological planting strategy, tropical restoration and revegetation projects run into obstacles. Ecologists call these inhibitors, factors that slow or arrest succession and prevent the system from moving toward your design goals. The first is lianas, woody vines. These are incredibly aggressive in disturbed and secondary forest environments. Lianas can grow several meters per year, draping over young trees, suppressing their growth, and in severe cases causing crown collapse. In restoration projects, liana management is one of the most labor-intensive ongoing tasks. You need a strategy for it from the beginning. The second is aggressive grasses. They can form dense monocultures, suppress tree seedlings, and maybe even increase fire frequency because they dry out quickly and burn easily. Once certain species of grasses establish, it's extremely difficult to remove them. Prevention is far more effective than treatment. The third is arrested succession. Situations where succession stops at an intermediate state and doesn't progress farther. This can happen for many reasons: soil conditions, lack of seed sources, ongoing disturbance, or liana and grass dominance. Recognizing and diagnosing arrested succession is an important skill. And the fourth is actually a solution rather than a problem: nurse plants. These are fast-growing species that you plant intentionally to create shade and microclimate conditions that allow more sensitive species to establish underneath them. Think of them as temporary infrastructure. They do a job in the early phases and then are gradually phased out as the canopy develops. One of the most practically useful frameworks for plant selection and tropical design is trait-based selection. Choosing species not just by name or aesthetics, but by the functional traits that determine how they'll perform in your specific site conditions. Let's walk through the 4 key trait categories on the slide. Dense wood equals drought resistance. Wood density is a good predictor of a plant's hydraulic efficiency and drought tolerance. Dense wooded species tend to have more robust vascular systems that resist cavitation, the collapse of water columns under tension during drought. In seasonal or dry climates, dense wood is a trait worth prioritizing. Root allocation equals nutrient strategy. Species that invest heavily in root biomass are generally adapted to poor or difficult soils. They're putting their energy into foraging for water and nutrients rather than building above-ground structure. This tells you something about the soil conditions they evolved in and whether they'll match your site. Match the species to soil fertility. This is a big one. Using species adapted to nutrient-poor soils on a rich, fertile site can actually cause problems. They may grow too fast, allocate resources poorly, or be outcompeted by weeds adapted to fertility. And conversely, putting a species from fertile floodplain into degraded leach soil is setting it up to fail. And finally, functional redundancy. Building redundancy into your palette, multiple species that fill the same functional role, means that if one species fails due to pest, disease, or unusual climate, the function is provided is still covered by another. Resilience through redundancy. We're approaching the conclusion of today's lecture, and I want to bring all this knowledge together into a design philosophy that I think is essential for practice in the 21st century: designing for adaptation and resilience. What does that actually mean? Multifunctional landscapes. The most resilient tropical landscapes serve multiple functions simultaneously. They provide shade and cooling, they manage stormwater, they support biodiversity, they produce food, they protect coastlines. Designs that stack functions are inherently more resilient because if one function is stressed or disrupted, others continue to operate. Think about how you can layer ecological services into every project. Connectivity. In a fragmented tropical landscape connectivity, the ability of animals and plants to move between habitat patches is crucial for long-term ecological viability. As a designer, you can create or restore corridors, design green infrastructure that links parks and reserves, and choose planting that provides stepping stone habitat. This isn't just idealistic, it's practically important for the long-term performance of your planted landscapes. Flexible management. Fixed, rigid management prescriptions don't work well in dynamic tropical systems. Design management frameworks that can be adjusted as the landscape develops, as species establish, and as conditions change. Building, monitoring, and decision points. And finally, monitoring and adjustment. Design is not a one-time event in ecological terms. It's an ongoing process. Build monitoring into your projects. Track plant establishment, species diversity, canopy development. Be willing to intervene, remove inhibitors, introduce missing species, adjust management as you learn from what's actually happening on the ground. We've covered a lot of ground today, so let me bring it back to the essential ideas I want you to walk away with. Tropical ecosystems are dynamic. They are not stable, static backdrops for your design work. They change seasonally. They respond to disturbance. They succeed through time. Your designs need to account for and work with this dynamism. Not try to hold it still. They are disturbance driven. Floods, fire, treefall gaps, cyclones, these are not exceptional events. They are the ecological engine that maintains tropical diversity and function. Design for disturbance, anticipate it, build resilience to it. They are biodiverse but fragile. The extraordinary species richness of tropical ecosystems is a product of millions of years of evolution under relatively stable conditions, but many of those highly specialized ecological relationships, pollinators, seed dispersers, mutualists, are vulnerable to even modest human disruption. Biodiversity is not just a measure of ecological health, it's a foundation of ecosystem function. And finally, and most importantly for your careers, ecology underpins design. Every design decision you make in a tropical context, species selection, grading, drainage, maintenance scheduling, either works with or against the ecological systems on your site. The designers who understand ecology make better, more enduring, more responsible landscapes. To close out this lecture, I want to leave you with 3 questions that I'd like you to sit with. The first question is, how should tropical parks differ from temperate parks? Think about everything we've discussed today. Disturbance regimes, succession, soil conditions, the role of fauna, the absence of cold winters, and ask yourself, what design assumptions do we import from temperate traditions that simply don't apply in tropical systems? What needs to be unlearned? The second question, what happens when tropical landscapes are over-designed? When we try to control everything, eliminate succession, maintain monocultures, suppress disturbance, what are the ecological consequences? And is there a point at which intensive management actually undermines long-term performance? And the third question, can natural landscapes be designed? There's an inherent tension here. We're landscape architects. We design. But the most ecologically sophisticated tropical landscapes are ones that appear natural, that follow ecological logic, that change over times in ways we don't fully control. Where does design end and ecology begin? Is that even the right way to frame it? These are questions without clean answers, but wrestling with them is part of becoming a thoughtful, ecologically informed landscape architect.